Today we have Keith Harris of PPL, who is the Director of Perform Affairs. PPL is an organisation that collects royalties for both record labels and performers. It's the only organisation in the UK to do this.
It was founded in 1934. What happened was, in 1934, a small coffee shop in Bristol was sued by a record company called the Gramophone Company, which went on to become EMI Records. And the reason they sued them was because they were taking sound recordings which the Gramophone Company had made and just playing them to entertain their customers, for afternoon tea and coffee. Before that, of course, they'd have had a string quartet or something playing in the corner. So the Gramophone Company thought, well, this isn't very fair. We've paid all the musicians, we've actually paid for the recording. They're just taking this material, which is our copyright, and using it to enhance their business. And that they won that lawsuit, and it's established that if you use somebody's copyright in a sound recording for any kind of commercial purposes in terms of enhancing your business, giving it a better atmosphere, anything like that, you should make a payment to the copyright owners. So PPL was actually instigated to collect the money on behalf of the copyright owners for the use of music in business, or broadcast, or anywhere else that the copyright is exploited. Okay, well, what I should have said, or what I should say, is that what happened was, in the early stages of PPL, the right was granted only to the copyright owners, so the money all went to the record companies. In the 1940s, they made a voluntary agreement with the Musicians' Union. They would pay some of the money they were receiving across to the artists. And that payment remained voluntary right up until, in Britain, 1996. What happened was, in 1995, the EU adopted a treaty, it's called the WPPT, the White Power Performance and Phonograms Treaty. And that said, for the first time, the performers had to receive their fair share of the money that the copyright owners were collecting. They call it equitable remuneration, because it's written by lawyers. Okay. So since then, the performers had a legal right to get paid the share of the money that was being collected. In the early stages of that payment becoming a legal right in the UK, the performers tried to start their own collection societies to collect the money, and PPL was still the Record Company Society. That didn't really work very well for various reasons, and it made sense for a joint society to be formed. So the performers folded their rights into PPL to collect on their behalf as well as on the behalf of the record companies. So PPL is now a joint society that collects money for performers and record companies, splits it 50-50, performers get half, record companies get half, right? And as far as the performers are concerned, they should join PPL as soon as they're performing on any recording which is getting a public airing. So, if you're a session player, it's not just the featured performers, or the contracted performers, it's all the session players as well. So if you're doing a session for somebody and you think it might end up on radio or getting broadcast, you should join PPL. The plus side of it, really, it's quite a simple formula. It costs you nothing and we give you money, right? So you might as well join really as soon as you are, involved in some kind of professional recording. Okay, PPL collects all their performance royalties. What the treaty said was, when your music is communicated to the public, and that really means broadcast or in any way played out to the public, off the record, then PPL can collect. It's quite important to make that distinction between, say, PPL and PRS, because the PRS, the Performing Rights Society, they collect for the songwriters and the publishers. To make it very clear so that people actually understand the difference. Say an artist, say like Kylie Minogue, who doesn't actually write her material. Say Can't Get It Out of My Head, for example, was written by Rob Davis and Kathy Dennis. So the PRS would collect for Rob Davis, Kathy Dennis and their publisher. Right? The PPL would collect for Kylie, all the session players on the record, and for EMI Records, her record company. So that should probably make it quite clear, the difference between the two. Now, what happens is, as a not-for-profit company, the way that PPL distributes the money is the running costs of this organisation are taken off the top, and then the rest of the money is distributed amongst the record companies and performers. Okay, PPL can collect for you around the world if you give the organisation your international mandate. You have to say we would like you to collect around the world, and we have agreements with a load, most of the major territories around the world. We have an agreement where we collect for their performers in the UK, they collect for ours. And the way the distributions work is that the main distribution of PPL money comes annually at the end of June. So PPL then pays retrospectively for the airplay for the previous year. The international money comes in kind of dribs and drabs depending on what the payment schedules are of the international territories that PPL is collected from. So what PPL does is it collects that money and it actually distributes that international money. Up until now we've been distributing it within 90 days of when we receive it. We're actually going to move to a system of quarterly distributions. So every quarter you will get money from the international territories that we have collected in the previous quarter. And then at the end of June you will get the big PPL national distribution. Now, as far as missing out on money, obviously as far as radio is concerned, and particularly big radio stations, it's pretty straightforward because the BBC and the big commercial stations give us 100% reporting. They tell us every piece of music they've used, and we then match that against our database of recordings and distribute the money in the right amounts. Where it comes to other public performance, for instance in shops, clubs, restaurants, hairdressers, all these kind of places, it's definitely not an exact science. You know, we do try to buy data from people who do that kind of survey. We do extrapolate from what's been in the charts. You know, so we actually use various devices to try to get a rough payment of how much the music is being used. We also have people who are called dubbers. And what dubbers do, if you've ever worked in a shop, you'll understand this because it kind of drives you mad if you work in a shop. The music's on a loop and it just goes round and round and round, right? And what happens is that's because we license these people to compile tapes for shops, right? And they then put them in the shops and they give us some kind of reporting of how long it's been used in the shop, and that also enables us to get some kind of a measure of how much the music has been out there. So that's you're unlikely to miss out. The other thing which I should say is that the way in which PPL becomes aware of a musician performing on the tracks, the copyright owner or record company, I say copyright owner because it could be just somebody self-releasing, in which case they own the copyright. They are supposed to tell us all the musicians on every recording that they register. Right? Now, obviously, they don't necessarily do that as well as they should. So when you sign to PPL as a performer, you get a login for something called My PPL. And that My PPL then allows you to go onto the PPL database and look at any recordings that you were on and see whether you have actually been registered on that recording. If not, you then make a claim. You say, I was on this recording. And all you have to provide is some kind of evidence, like maybe a sleeve credit, maybe you could get the original producer to verify you're on it, or one of the other players, just something to prove that you're on the track. And we then add you to the track and you get paid automatically. You don't have to do anything else. You don't have to make, PPL puts it on the database, gets all the reporting back for the usage and pays the musicians. Yeah, if you self-release, you effectively join PPL twice. You join us as a label, or I prefer to say a copyright owner, because a lot of people don't see themselves as a record label, and it puts people off. You say, oh, you join us as a record company, you think, oh, I'm not really a record company. Look, if you own the copyright in the recording, if it's yours, then you join as a copyright owner or as a record label. But you also join again as a performer, because obviously there's the two 50%, there's the record company share and the performer share. Now, if you're the only performer on the record, you're going to get all the money for that. But what is more likely to happen is that you join as a label because you've self-released, but there were other musicians on it. So when you join, you tell us who the other players were. You will get your 50% as a label share. The other 50% will be divided between you and the other musicians on it in the right proportions. The way it works is that this is, roughly, I mean, it's quite complicated, the formulas, but broadly speaking, what happens is the featured performers or the contracted performers, the ones that actually sign the deal to the record label, they get 65% of the money. The session players or the non-featured performers share 35% between them. Okay, right. The ISRC stands for the International Standard Recording Code. And it originated back at the beginning of the 80s, I think. And the idea was that in order to identify recordings quite simply, if you think about books, on any book there's something called an ISBN, International Standard Book Number, and it identifies any book. So you can find a book. If you've seen a book that you wanted to buy and you can't track it down the library, if you can give them the ISBN, they'll be able to look it up on a big database and find it for you. The ISRC is a similar thing. It's a series of 12 numbers which are broken down to various parts. One part identifies the country, one part identifies the copyright owner, one part identifies the actual product, or the label, and then the individual unit. Now, ISRCs are important to us because every individual recording will have an ISRC, which allows, say the BBC, when they report to us what they've played, if they give us an ISRC, we can actually identify exactly the track. And if you think about it, that's quite important because you might have a different mix of the same song, and the different mixes might have different musicians on, which means we have to actually pay different musicians for different mixes. So that ISRC number is actually really quite important to us. And what happens is when you send your track off to manufacture, you will actually give whoever's manufacturing the product for you, be it even if it's a digital release, you will give them their ISRC, and they embed it in what's known as the metadata, which is the information about the track. So anytime that track is used, we know exactly what the track was. So that's the idea behind it. Okay, first of all, to understand about MCPS, MCPS stands for the Mechanical Copyright Protection Society. To try and simplify this so that people can understand the self-release, what happened was, years ago, when composers first were making music, they would make music and they would make a living by selling copies of the sheet music. Somebody could play it on the piano, right? And that's how they made their living. Then some bright spark invented a player piano. So you bought like a piano roll, stuck it in the piano played itself, right? Now what that meant was, all of a sudden, people weren't really selling the sheet music because the piano's playing itself. Nobody has to look at and sight read it. So what happened was, the copyright still existed in the music, and it was being copied. So a payment should be being paid to the composers. So what was invented was something called the mechanical right. And the idea behind it was, whenever music is put into a form where it can be played by a machine, then a royalty should be payable. And that's what the mechanical right is. And that's what the MCPS was brought in to collect, the mechanical copyright in the work. So what happens is that anytime something is being put into a form, I mean, when you say machine, it doesn't mean it's got to have moving parts. An iPod is a machine. A hard drive is a machine. So whenever music is put into a place where it has to be put into mechanical form, a copyright is payable. Right? Now what happens is that the PPL shares information with MCPS in that PPL is actually the central repository for manufacturers to tell us when they've put stuff into mechanical form. There is an agreement with the record companies and with the manufacturing plants that when they manufacture music, they have to notify us that they have manufactured so many units, in other words, so many bits of machinery that can reproduce this music, right? And we then pass that information onto MCPS, so they then know that this much has been manufactured. So that's the information we share with them, and it's just to make sure that people get paid properly. We do a lot of what is known as outreach work. I mean, I was in Edinburgh yesterday doing a seminar, similar thing, talking about PPL and talking to individuals about PPL. We're doing something next week. We go to pretty much all the trade fairs. We're doing something at Liverpool Sound City, The Great Escape, I go down to go north in Scotland. I'm going to Wrexham next week. So we're out and about trying to make people aware of how it all operates. Also on the day of the annual performer meeting, we have an annual performer meeting. Performers are invited in to basically have a look around the building and talk to people and do little workshops for them so they can kind of understand how it works better. Which we try to get the information out there as much as possible. Well, it's a difficult question. The thing about the use of music and the placement of music is that the way you get paid for music has changed. Right. It used to be that you get paid more for people actually owning an individual piece than for it actually being used. Now usage is becoming increasingly important. Where your music gets used tends to be, depending on the deals you do, tends to be kind of how you get paid. Obviously the biggest things are often what are known as synchronization licenses, where music is put to a film or a commercial or something along those lines, because they get multiple uses. And because it's a very commercial process, some of the bigger companies are prepared to pay very significant amounts of money for the right to use your music, and enhance it with a product. A really good example of what I'm talking about in terms of music being used with a product is say that the Phil Collins Gorilla ad on Cadbury's. Those kind of things have enormous value to the commercial brand, and they're prepared to pay large sums of money for their use. The biggest thing I would say, first of all, I should say to you that to give you an idea just of the scale of what's going on out there, PPL on average registers 6,500 new titles every week, right? So to give you some idea of just what it's come down to, right? In terms of rising above the noise, it's actually quite simple. You have to be really good, right? It's one of those things where one of the things that gets overlooked, because I do quite a lot of these seminars, I go to quite a lot of seminars and I see people talking about social networking and all these various tools you can do to get music. And yes, that's good. I'm not knocking any of that. What people often forget to mention, if your music is rubbish, I don't care what you do. People don't care. So that's the most important thing, is be really, really good at what you do. If you're supposed to be a guitar player, learn to play. You're supposed to be singing, at least hit the right note every once in a while. It's one of those things where people actually tend to forget it's quite simple, music. It's quite a visceral thing. And people tend to love it or hate it. It's individual. But my biggest tip is go out there and get really good at what you do.